Imagine waking up one morning and your money is worth half of what it was yesterday. Not metaphorically, literally. The bread you bought last week for 50 cents now costs $5. Your rent just tripled. Your savings evaporated overnight. And when you go online to complain about it, the internet shuts down completely. Now imagine this isn't a dystopian movie. It's Tuesday in Tehran. Right now, in January 2026, millions of Iranians are flooding the streets in what could be the largest protest movement in the country's modern history. But here's what the headlines aren't telling you. This isn't just about politics. This isn't just about religion. This is about economics. It's about a currency that's collapsing faster than Venezuela's. It's about a generation that was promised prosperity and got poverty instead. It's about what happens when you corner 5 million people with nothing left to lose. Before we dive into the economic forces tearing Iran apart, hit that subscribe button and join the Wealth Forum. We break down the real economic stories behind the headlines that shape our world. Today, we're explaining why Iran is exploding right now, and why this time might actually be different. To understand what's happening in Iran right now, you need to understand one brutal fact. This isn't Iran's first rodeo. Iranians have been protesting for decades. In 2009, millions took to the streets after a disputed election, in what became known as the Green Movement. The regime crushed it. In 2017 and 2018, protests erupted over economic collapse and government corruption. The regime crushed those too. In 2019, fuel price hikes triggered the deadliest crackdown in the Islamic Republic's history. Over 1,500 people were killed in just a few days. Then in 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody sparked months of nationwide protests led by women and young people chanting "Woman, Life, Freedom." The regime crushed that movement as well. Each time the pattern was the same. Protests erupt. The world watches. The internet gets shut down. Security forces crack down violently. And eventually, through exhaustion, fear, and isolation, the movement fades. So why should 2026 be any different? Because this time it's not about one issue. It's about everything collapsing at once. The currency is in free fall. Inflation is destroying the middle class. Unemployment among young people is catastrophic. International sanctions are choking the economy. And the government's own corruption and mismanagement have created a perfect storm. Here's the number that tells you everything. In 2015, $1 bought you about 32,000 Iranian rials. Today in January 2026, $1 buys you over 700,000 rials. That's a collapse of more than 95% in just over a decade. Imagine your entire life savings losing 95% of its value. Your parents' pensions, your salary, your ability to buy food, all destroyed by mathematics. This isn't a political crisis that happens to have economic consequences. This is an economic crisis that's destroying the political and social fabric of the entire country. And when you understand the economics, you understand why millions of people have reached a breaking point. Let's break down how Iran's economy actually works, or more accurately, how it's stopped working. Iran should be rich. It has the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, and the second largest natural gas reserves. It's sitting on an ocean of energy wealth. For decades, oil revenue was the engine of the Iranian economy. The government used oil money to fund everything: subsidies for food and fuel, public sector salaries, infrastructure, social programs. The entire system ran on black gold. But there's a problem. When the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed crippling sanctions, Iran's ability to sell oil collapsed. Before sanctions, Iran was exporting about 2.5 million barrels per day. After maximum pressure sanctions, that dropped to as low as 200,000 barrels per day. Even with some sanctions evasion through China and other buyers, exports remain dramatically below previous levels. So imagine your household income getting cut by 70 to 80% overnight. What do? You can cut spending, or you can print money. The Iranian government chose option 2. Here's where it gets catastrophic. When you can't sell oil but you still need to pay government workers, fund the military, maintain subsidies, and keep the lights on, you turn to the central bank. And the central bank does what desperate central banks always do. It prints money, lots of it. The Iranian rial started collapsing. In 2012, $1 bought about 12,000 rials. By 2020, it was 200,000. By 2024, it was 500,000. And now in January 2026, it's over 700,000 and accelerating. This is hyperinflation in slow motion. Here's what that actually means on the ground. A family that could afford a decent middle-class life 5 years ago can now barely afford to eat. Teachers, engineers, doctors, government workers, all watching their salaries become worthless in real time. The official inflation rate is somewhere around 40 to 50% annually. But anyone actually buying groceries knows it's much higher for essential goods. But it's not just inflation. It's what economists call the triple crisis. Crisis 1, currency collapse. Your money is worthless and getting worse every day. Crisis 2, unemployment and underemployment. Official unemployment is around 10%, but youth unemployment is estimated at twice that or higher. Millions of educated young Iranians can't find jobs that match their skills, or any jobs at all. Crisis 3, brain drain. The best and brightest are leaving. Doctors, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs. Anyone with skills and resources is trying to get out. Iran is bleeding its most valuable asset, human capital. When you combine these three crises, you get something explosive. A massive population of young, educated, unemployed people watching their futures disappear, while a tiny elite connected to the Revolutionary Guards gets rich off smuggling, sanctions evasion, and corruption. Here's the bitter irony. Iran's government blames all of this on foreign sanctions, the economic war narrative. And yes, sanctions have absolutely devastated the economy. But here's what the government doesn't mention. Where did the money that did come in actually go? Billions have been spent funding proxy militias in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Billions went to the nuclear program. Billions disappeared into corruption and mismanagement. While ordinary Iranians were eating less, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was expanding its business empire and regional influence. This created a narrative that millions of Iranians have internalized. We're poor not because of America. We're poor because our own government chose missiles over medicine, chose proxies over prosperity, chose ideology over the people. And then there's the subsidy cuts. For decades, Iran heavily subsidized fuel, bread, and other essentials. These subsidies were the social contract. The government couldn't provide freedom or democracy, but it could provide cheap gas and affordable food. Starting in 2019 and continuing into recent years, the government has been forced to cut these subsidies as the budget collapsed. When fuel prices tripled overnight in 2019, the country exploded. The 2026 protests are happening in the same context. New subsidy cuts, new price increases. The social contract is completely broken. The government has nothing left to offer. No prosperity, no freedom, no hope, just survival. And even survival is getting harder. So what actually triggered the current explosion in January 2026? It wasn't one thing. It was the final straw on a camel's back that was already broken. Reports suggest that in early January, the government announced another round of subsidy cuts and price increases on basic goods. Bread prices reportedly doubled in some areas. Fuel prices increased again. Electricity costs surged. All of this while the rial was in another downward spiral against the dollar. For millions of families, this was the moment the math stopped working. You can't cut your food budget anymore. You can't take another job because there are no jobs. You can't save because your savings are worthless. You're trapped. And when people are trapped with no economic escape route, they take to the streets. But here's what makes 2026 different from previous protests. The demographics have shifted. Iran has one of the youngest populations in the Middle East. About 60% of Iranians are under 30 years old. This is a generation that doesn't remember the 1979 revolution. They don't remember the Iran-Iraq War. They don't have the same ideological attachment to the Islamic Republic that their grandparents did. What they do remember is promises. They were told that if Iran just endured sanctions, prosperity would come. They were told education would lead to good jobs. They were told the nuclear program would bring respect and economic benefits. Every single promise was broken. This generation grew up with smartphones and VPNs. They see how people their age live in Turkey, in Dubai, in Europe. They see the gap between the propaganda and the reality, and they're done. The protest movement this time is decentralized and leaderless. There's no single opposition figure the regime can arrest to behead the movement. It's organic, spread through encrypted messaging apps and word of mouth. The chants have evolved too. In 2009, protesters chanted, "Where is my vote?" focused on electoral fraud. In 2022, they chanted, "Woman life," freedom, focused on social freedoms. In 2026, the chants are more fundamental. Death to the dictator. We don't want the Islamic Republic. Mullahs must go. This isn't reform. This is rejection of the entire system. And economically, it makes sense. When you've lost everything, you have nothing left to lose. The fear that kept people home in previous years has been replaced by desperation and rage. The government's response has followed the same brutal playbook. Internet shutdowns to prevent organization and documentation. Deployment of security forces, including the Basij militia and Revolutionary Guards. Mass arrests. live ammunition against protesters. But here's the problem the regime faces. The economic crisis means they can't even pay their own enforcers properly. Reports have emerged of unpaid or underpaid security forces. When inflation destroys everyone's purchasing power, it destroys loyalty too. Even the people with guns are suffering. Some analysts suggest that parts of the security apparatus are less willing to crack down as violently as in the past because they and their families are also victims of the economic collapse. There's another factor making this different: international context. In previous protest waves, Iran could count on some level of international support or at least indifference from regional powers. But in 2026, Iran is more isolated than ever. Its primary patron, Russia, is bogged down and weakened. Its relationship with China is transactional, not ideological. Arab states that Iran spent decades cultivating influence over are increasingly tired of Iranian interference. The regional balance that once protected Iran is shifting. Even domestically, there are fractures within the regime itself. Hardliners versus pragmatists, old revolutionaries versus younger technocrats, the revolutionary guards versus the traditional clergy. Economic collapse doesn't just threaten the people. It threatens the entire patronage system that keeps the regime together. When you can't pay off your supporters, your coalition starts to crack. Here's the terrifying possibility that has the regime scared. What if the protests don't stop this time? What if the economic pressure is so severe that no amount of crackdowns can restore stability? What if the security forces themselves start to fracture? History shows that regimes don't fall because protesters are brave. They fall when the men with guns stop following orders. And economic collapse is the single biggest driver of that kind of fracture. When your soldiers can't feed their families, when police officers see their own children suffering, loyalty becomes negotiable. The Iranian regime knows this. That's why the crackdowns are so brutal. They're not just trying to stop protests. They're trying to prevent a cascade. Stop the protests before the economic crisis creates cracks in the security forces. Stop the cracks before those cracks become splits. Stop the splits before the entire structure collapses. But here's the problem with that strategy. It's too late. The economic damage is done. You can't reverse currency collapse with bullets. You can't print jobs. You can't arrest inflation. The tools the regime has left are violence and propaganda, and both are reaching their limits. Every crackdown creates more martyrs. Every internet shutdown creates more resentment. Every bullet fired at a protester creates 10 more protesters. The regime is in a trap of its own making. Decades of corruption, mismanagement, regional adventurism, and ideological rigidity have destroyed the economic foundation the system needed to survive. And now, in January 2026, the bill is coming due. So what happens next? Let's wargame the scenarios. Because the ripple effects of Iran's crisis will be felt far beyond its borders. Scenario 1. The regime survives but is permanently weakened. They crush the protests again through sheer brutality. The internet stays dark. Thousands are arrested. The movement disperses, but the economic crisis doesn't go away. Sanctions remain. The currency keeps falling. Brain drain accelerates. Iran becomes a zombie state, technically still functioning but hollowed out, isolated, and perpetually on the edge of collapse. In this scenario, regional instability increases because a desperate regime becomes more unpredictable and aggressive to distract from domestic problems. Scenario 2. Regime change from within. Fractures in the establishment lead to a palace coup. Pragmatists or reformists within the system push out the hardliners in a deal to save the regime itself. They promise reforms, economic opening, and negotiations with the West in exchange for sanctions relief. This is the soft landing scenario, but history suggests it's unlikely. Hardliners rarely give up power voluntarily, and even if they did, would the protesters accept it? After everything, would Iranians accept regime change that keeps the Islamic Republic structure intact just with different faces? Maybe not. Scenario 3. Revolution and collapse. The protests grow so large and sustained that security forces fracture. Parts of the military refuse to fire on civilians. The regime loses control of major cities. What follows is chaos, a power vacuum, competing factions, possibly civil conflict. This is the scenario that terrifies not just the regime, but also international observers. A chaotic collapse of Iran would destabilize the entire Middle East. What happens to Iran's nuclear facilities? What happens to its proxy networks? What happens to the millions of refugees that would flee? Revolution sounds romantic until you're living through the aftermath. Just ask Libya, Syria, or Yemen. Scenario 4. The long stalemate. Protests continue at a lower level for months or years. The regime maintains control of institutions but loses legitimacy completely. Iran becomes ungovernable but doesn't collapse. Economic decline continues. More people leave. The country slowly bleeds out over a decade. This might actually be the most likely scenario because it requires the least dramatic shift. But it's also the cruelest. A slow-motion catastrophe where hope dies gradually instead of all at once. For the people living through it, this might be worse than revolution because there's no catharsis. No resolution, just endless suffering. No matter which scenario plays out, the consequences are massive. For the region, a weakened or collapsed Iran changes everything. Hezbollah in Lebanon loses its main patron. Assad in Syria loses critical support. The Houthis in Yemen face isolation. The entire axis of resistance that Iran built over decades could fragment. Saudi Arabia and Israel would see this as a strategic victory. Turkey would likely try to fill the vacuum. Russia and China would lose a key partner. The geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East would be completely redrawn. For global energy markets, Iran's oil is already largely offline due to sanctions. But if the country descends into chaos, even the black market exports that still happen would stop. In a tight global oil market, that creates price spikes, inflation in the West, economic stress everywhere. The paradox is that the world needs Iran's oil to come back online, legally to ease prices, but that requires a deal, and a deal requires a stable government to negotiate with. For the Iranian people themselves, every scenario involves immense suffering. Even if the regime falls, the transition would be brutal. Economic reconstruction would take decades, political reconstruction even longer. The model of post-revolutionary transitions is not encouraging. Russia after the Soviet Union, Iraq after Saddam, Libya after Gaddafi, Egypt after Mubarak. The pattern is clear. Getting rid of a dictatorship is step 1. Building something better is step 100, and the journey between them is filled with pain. But here's the thing. Despite all that risk, despite all that uncertainty, millions of Iranians are choosing the streets over silence. That tells you everything about how unbearable the status quo has become. When the guaranteed suffering of the present outweighs the possible suffering of an unknown future, people revolt. That calculation has been made, not by elites in conference rooms, but by ordinary people in their kitchens, looking at empty wallets and empty refrigerators, deciding they can't do this anymore. The international community faces a dilemma. Support the protesters and risk destabilizing a nuclear threshold state, maintain sanctions and watch the humanitarian crisis deepen, negotiate with a regime that's killing its own people. Every option is bad. There are no clean hands in this story. Western sanctions accelerated the economic collapse, but the Iranian regime's corruption and choices made that collapse catastrophic. Everyone shares blame. Everyone will share consequences. So what's the lesson here? What does Iran's crisis teach us about economics, power, and human nature? First, economics always wins in the end. You can have the most powerful military, the most sophisticated intelligence services, the most effective propaganda, but if people can't afford to live, none of it matters. Legitimacy doesn't come from ideology or force. It comes from prosperity, or at minimum, survival. When a government can no longer provide either, it's living on borrowed time. Iran's regime thought it could sustain itself through repression and regional influence while the domestic economy collapsed. They were wrong. You cannot build rockets while your people starve and expect stability. The mathematics don't work. Second, there's always a breaking point. Every society has a threshold where fear gives way to fury, where self-preservation flips from keep your head down to we have nothing left to lose. That threshold is different for every culture and context. But it exists, and economic desperation is the fastest way to reach it. The Iranian regime miscalculated. They thought they could manage the decline, calibrate the repression, keep people just comfortable enough to not rebel. But economic collapse moves faster than political calculations. The point of no return arrives before you see it coming. Third, the young always overthrow the old eventually. Every authoritarian regime faces the same demographic time bomb. The generation that made the revolution ages. The generation born into the system has no loyalty to it. They didn't fight for it. They didn't choose it. They just inherited it. And if it doesn't deliver for them, they'll tear it down. Iran's youth don't care about 1979. They care about 2026. They care about jobs, futures, freedom, and dignity. The regime offers none of those things, so the regime is fighting against time itself. And time always wins. Fourth, isolation is a slow death. When you cut yourself off from the global economy, you don't become self-sufficient. You become poor. North Korea proves it. Venezuela proves it. Cuba proves it. Iran is proving it again. Autarky is a fairy tale. No country, no matter how rich in resources, can thrive in isolation. The global economy is integrated. Trying to opt out means opting into decline. Iran chose ideology over integration. The price is being paid by 85 million people. Finally, this is what economic collapse actually looks like. Not a Hollywood sudden crash, but a grinding, years-long deterioration that destroys the middle class, radicalizes the young, and eventually makes the entire system unsustainable. We're watching it in real time, and it's not unique to Iran. Any country that combines corruption, mismanagement, international isolation, and authoritarianism is on the same path. The speed varies, the details differ, but the destination is the same. You can only ignore economic reality for so long before reality reasserts itself violently. So here's my final question for you. If you were a young Iranian right now, what would you do? Would you take to the streets knowing you might be killed? Would you try to leave knowing you might never see your family again? Would you stay silent and endure knowing it will only get worse? There's no right answer. But thinking about that question forces us to confront what we take for granted. Economic stability, political freedom, a future that's possible to imagine. Millions of Iranians don't have any of those things, and that's why they're in the streets. Not because they're radicals, but because they're desperate, and desperation is the most powerful force in politics. If this deep dive into Iran's economic collapse opened your eyes to what's really happening, smash that like button, subscribe to the Wealth Forum, and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep following this story as it unfolds. The Iranian Revolution of 2026 might be just beginning, or it might be crushed like all the others. Either way, the economics that created this crisis aren't going anywhere, and understanding those economics is the key to understanding what happens next. I'll see you in the next one. Stay informed, stay curious, and never forget that economics isn't just numbers. It's people's lives.